I was 5 minutes away from stepping onto the stage to take my oath when my phone buzzed on the vanity table beside me and lit up with a text from my mother that froze the air around me. "We are too tired from your sister's wedding to make it to your ceremony. It is just a government job anyway." Those words pierced through me with the sharpness of betrayal I had carried for years, but had tried to ignore. They thought I was a clerk. They had no idea I was about to be sworn in as the youngest federal judge in New York. They also had no idea that the man who had paid for their champagne brunch and spa treatment was about to be a defendant in my courtroom. I stood in the dressing room of the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse in Washington, D.C., staring at myself in the mirror. The robe draped over my shoulders was heavier than it looked, dark black silk with folds that whispered with every movement. It was not just fabric. It was a shield, a declaration. I was no longer just Nia Brooks. I was about to be addressed as Your Honor, and no one in my bloodline seemed to care. I tried to steady my hands as I adjusted the pleats, but inside my chest, my heart pounded like it was trying to escape. My phone buzzed again, then again and again with the annoying cheer of group texts from my family chat, named the Brooks dynasty. Photos flashed onto the screen one after another. My younger sister Kesha holding a glass of champagne while lounging on a yacht. My mother Patris smiling in a new designer sun hat. My father Desmond laughing with Brad, who was now my brother-in-law, a white man with slick charm and deep pockets. They looked rich, they looked carefree, they looked like they had never known a day of struggle. Then came another message, this time directly from my mother, and my heart paused, hoping even now for something supportive. "Nia, honey, do not wait for us at the airport. We are not coming." The wedding celebrations in Martha's Vineyard went late, and honestly, we are too exhausted to fly to D.C. this morning. Brad booked us a spa day, you'll understand. Besides, it is just a swearing, and right, just government stuff. "You're always so independent. Send us a photo. Love, Mom." The silence in the room swallowed every sound but the buzz of my phone dying in my hand. That was what they thought this day meant, just paperwork. I was about to receive a lifetime appointment from the President of the United States to serve as a federal judge, and to them it was an errand I could do alone. A spa day had won over history. I did not cry. I would not cry. I took one last look in the mirror and typed a short response to my mother, "Rest well." Then I turned off the phone and dropped it into my purse like it was just another object from a life I was leaving behind. The woman in the mirror looked back with calm eyes, but inside her chest a storm was gathering. That woman was no longer their daughter. She was Judge Brooks, and it was time to take her seat at the bench. I stepped into the back seat of the government SUV, the leather cool and smooth beneath me, as the vehicle pulled away from the curb and into the humming gray streets of D.C. The buildings passed in a blur, but my mind was stuck in the moment just 1 hour earlier when I had called my father in a final moment of weakness. I needed to hear him say he was proud just once. I wanted some signal from him that the years I had spent grinding through law school and working late nights were not wasted. But all I heard when he picked up was the clatter of silverware and the background laughter of Kesha. Dad, I had said, trying to keep my voice steady, "This is not just a promotion. I have been nominated by the president. I am becoming a federal judge. Do you know what that means?" There was a pause, then a long sigh like I had just told him the car needed gas. "Oh, Nia, you always make everything so dramatic," he said with the same tired tone that made my childhood feel like a courtroom where I was always on trial. "You act like you cured cancer. It is a job, a government job. A salary, a pension, that's it." He chuckled, and I heard him sip something, probably a mimosa. "Look at your sister." He said it like it was a punchline. "Brad surprised her this morning with a diamond necklace. A real one, vintage Cartier, that probably costs more than your whole year's paycheck. Now that's success. That's how you secure your future." The sting of his words felt like acid. "Dad," I tried again, but he cut me off. "You chose a gavel. Kesha chose a husband. A white husband who works on Wall Street and knows how to build a legacy. You could have done the same, but you spent your years buried in books, and look where that got you. Going to a ceremony alone. Think about that." Then he hung up, Just like that, I stared out the window as the SUV slowed down at a red light. I swallowed hard, but the lump in my throat would not go away. The stone steps of the courthouse came into view majestic and cold like a palace built by justice for those who dared to earn it. The marshal in a sharp black suit opened my door. He stood there like a statue, his face unreadable. But when he looked me in the eye, he did not see a failure or a forgotten daughter. He saw authority. He saw the Constitution in human form. "We have arrived, Your Honor," he said with respect that my own family had never learned to give me. I stepped out onto the pavement, letting the cold air wash away the last remnants of that phone call. Meanwhile, just a few hundred meters away, my family was lounging in luxury at the Harbor View Hotel. The sun reflected off the infinity pool, where Kesha sipped on something bright and expensive, as my mother lathered her legs in tanning oil. They were not thinking about justice or government service. They were ordering lobster and laughing at jokes Brad made about public servants and boring jobs. "I bet your sister is stuck in some cubicle right now pushing forms," Brad said smugly. "Imagine being that dull." My mother sighed lazily. "Nia has always been stiff. That is why she is still single. Honestly, thank God Kesha had the sense to marry someone with vision. You picked a winner, sweetheart." Kesha giggled, clinking her glass against Brad's. "She probably thinks she looks powerful in that robe. Meanwhile, we are living like royalty." But in that moment, Brad's phone buzzed and the color drained from his face. It was not a toast or a congratulations message. It was a burner number with one line: "We know you are in the vineyard. Wire the funds by noon or we release the documents to the SEC." Brad froze. The ice clinked in his glass, but the air around him turned to fire. His grip tightened on the phone. He did not let Kesha see the screen. Instead, he smiled that fake white smile and declared that it was time to go shopping. "New bags for everyone. It is on me." My mother and sister screamed with excitement, completely blind to the fear leaking from his pores. As I walked through the ceremonial courtroom doors, the air changed. 300 people stood in silence as I entered. Senators, jurists, the Attorney General. Every head turned to acknowledge me, but my eyes searched only one place. The first row, 4 chairs, each labeled in gold ink reserved for family. All of them empty. The shame was a knife in my gut, but I did not flinch. I walked forward. I raised my chin, and I became what they had refused to see. I stood before the Chief Justice who held out the Bible once used by Thurgood Marshall. I laid my left hand on its cover. I raised my right. My voice rang clear and powerful through the chamber. "I, Nia Brooks, do solemnly swear." The oath did not shake. My fingers closed around the gavel like it belonged to me, and when I turned to face the room, I did not look for my parents. I looked into the red dot of the news camera. I knew they would see it. Somewhere, on some television in some hotel suite, they would see what they had missed. I raised the gavel and brought it down with a thunderous crack that silenced every whisper of doubt. Court was in session, and I was in charge. While I stood at the center of the ceremonial courtroom with the polished gavel, still firm in my grip and the cheers echoing like waves crashing against cliffs, my family was sprawled out poolside in blissful ignorance, bathing in the kind of luxury they had always worshipped more than love, more than loyalty, and definitely more than me. Back at the exclusive Harbor View Hotel in Martha's Vineyard, the late morning sun kissed the water as if rewarding them for skipping my swearing in. My sister Kesha lay on a chaise lounge with her oversized sunglasses perched on her forehead, sipping a pink drink through a gold straw while scrolling through wedding photos that would soon be blasted all over social media with captions about forever and fairy tales. My mother Patris adjusted the straps on her floral swimsuit and flipped through a magazine while Brad reclined in a shaded cabana, swirling his scotch like a villain who thought he was untouchable. They had no idea that at that very moment their lives were starting to unravel thread by thread, stitch by stitch, and the person holding the scissors was not some prosecutor or creditor, but me, the very daughter they had written off like an expired coupon. As I stepped down from the marble platform to greet senators and legal dignitaries, my name was already trending on national news. I saw the flashes of cameras and the nods of respect, and the vice president herself placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered congratulations into my ear. And still all I could think about was the row of 4 empty chairs in the front, reserved for my family, draped in blue fabric, as pristine as the silence they had left behind. It would have hurt if I hadn't already built a heart thick enough to withstand it. Back at the pool, Brad leaned forward, his brows twitching slightly as he caught a notification that made his blood freeze. A burner number had just sent him a message that could not be ignored. The words were short, sharp, and merciless. "We know where you are. Wire the funds by noon or we leak the documents." Brad quickly dimmed the brightness of his phone, turned his body to block Kesha's view, and typed back a single word: "Understood." His hand trembled just enough for the ice in his glass to rattle, but he quickly raised his voice and turned on the charm like a light switch. "Let us go shopping," he declared, standing abruptly with a wide smile stretching across his face. "Bags for everyone. Today is on me." My sister squealed and jumped up, her arms in the air, as if they had just won a lottery, but in truth the bomb beneath their feet had already started ticking. Meanwhile, I had slipped away from the press and into a quiet back hallway lined with portraits of judges, past and present men with steel in their eyes and decades of case law behind their names. I paused in front of the frame that would soon hold my image and wondered for a moment what kind of legacy I would leave. One shaped by rejection, yes, but also by resilience forged not from praise but from silence. I moved into the reception room where waiters in tuxedos carried silver trays of sparkling cider and mini quiches. A senator from Massachusetts introduced me to the dean of Columbia Law School, who shook my hand as if passing me a baton and told me I had already become a legend on campus. I gave polite smiles, nods, all the right moves, but I felt hollow. I felt like I had won a war but had no one to come home to. The phone in my clutch buzzed again, and I pulled it out expecting another message from an aide. But it was not. It was a FaceTime request from Dad. My breath caught. My thumb hovered over the red button, but some tiny flicker of curiosity won and I answered. Desmond's face filled the screen's sweaty, disheveled eyes, wide like he had just seen a ghost. The image shook with motion as if he were in the back of a taxi. "Nia, why in God's name didn't you tell us it was this big?" he snapped without even greeting me. "You're all over CNN, the bishop called. People are blowing up my phone." "You said it was just a swearing in." I kept my face blank, my voice level. "I did not downplay anything, Dad. You just stopped listening." He waved a dismissive hand, and I could hear Mom shrieking something in the background. "It does not matter now," he barked. "We are on our way. We chartered a jet. We will be in D.C. in 2 hours. Tell the caterers to hold the food. We will walk in together. We will fix this." I stared at him with the same detachment I used when sentencing white-collar criminals. "That is not possible, Dad." His forehead creased. "Do not be petty, Nia. Just tell them your parents are arriving. They will wait." I switched the view on the camera slowly and deliberately. I showed them the massive room, the crystal chandeliers, the security agents by the door in black suits with earpieces. "You see those men?" I said coldly. "That is the Secret Service. The Vice President is here. This entire floor is a federal security zone. You are not on the list. You cannot get in. If you show up, the marshals will detain you." Mom's face appeared behind him, blotchy red, her voice shrill. "But we are your family." "That gives us no legal access," I replied, "and if I recall, you said you were too exhausted. Remember. Go back to your resort. Enjoy the spa. I have a job to do," and I ended the call. At that very moment, while they sat in the back of a taxi trying to reach a place they would never be allowed into, the news was already spreading like wildfire across networks. Footage of me standing beside the vice president, the applause, the gavel, the oath. Anchors were calling me a trailblazer, a symbol of hope, a woman who had risen from humble beginnings with no family connections and no legacy, but who had become a beacon of what was possible. The narrative was not just about what I had accomplished. It was about what they had failed to value. Meanwhile, at the airport in Martha's Vineyard, Desmond sat slumped in a leather chair, trying to fight off a headache with another Bloody Mary, while Patris snored beside him behind her oversized sunglasses. Kesha and Brad huddled over a phone screen, reviewing photos of the yacht party, while pretending not to see the headline flashing across every TV in the lounge. But Desmond saw it. He looked up just in time to see my face fill the screen in high resolution. He blinked. He leaned forward. The words below my name were clear and in bold. Youngest federal judge appointed to Southern District of New York. The anchor's voice followed. Sources close to Judge Brooks say she rose through the ranks without family backing, relying solely on merit and hard work. She is a self-made woman who had no one holding the ladder for her. Desmond's hands began to shake. His Bloody Mary slipped from his fingers and shattered across the tiled floor. Patris woke with a start and began fumbling for her ringing phone. The calls were pouring in. Sister Betty from church, the president of the local Jack and Jill chapter, neighbors, friends, enemies, all of them asking the same question. Why weren't you there? Patris answered one call with her best church voice. Oh, Betty, we are just enjoying some family time. Betty cut her off like a knife. Patris, why are you lying to the congregation? I am looking at MSNBC. Your daughter is standing next to the vice president. The entire country is celebrating her. Why are you not in that room? Patris's mouth went dry. She fumbled for a lie, but the weight of her own betrayal silenced her. She tried to say something about a private jet malfunction. She hung up before more questions could come, but the phone kept ringing. Kesha snatched it angrily. This is ridiculous, she muttered, her thumbs flying across the screen. Nia does not have the pull for this. She must have slept with a senator or something. There is no way this is real. She typed my name into Google. What she found hit her like a truck. Hundreds of articles, millions of search results, video clips. Interviews, analysis, commentaries, headlines proclaiming me the future of the judiciary. Her fingers trembled as she clicked the first image of me in full judicial robes, standing with dignity and poise. Kesha looked down at herself in a bikini with a fading spray tan and a phone filled with filtered selfies. Her lips curled into a snarl. This is not fair, she shrieked. She is ruining my wedding weekend. Brad, however, was not concerned with weddings or tantrums. He was staring at the letters Estienne, why flashing beneath my name. He knew what they meant. The Southern District of New York was not just a court. It was a powerhouse, the same court that brought down financial titans, the same court that did not play favorites, the same court now had a judge with a gavel and a grudge. His face went pale. He stood and said he needed the restroom, but he was already pulling out his phone and dialing. His lawyer picked up on the first ring. Tell me you saw it, Brad whispered. The lawyer's voice was tense. We saw it. She is real. Brad asked if I had access to active investigation files, if I could see the Cayman accounts. The lawyer replied that federal judges had wide access, and if I was on the bench in that district I could see everything. Brad's knees buckled. He stared at the bathroom mirror, trying to hold himself together. But it was too late. The clock had already started ticking, and I was coming, not as a sister, but as the law. The crystal chandeliers above the grand reception hall inside the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Courthouse bathed the crowd in a golden glow as I stood surrounded by lawmakers, scholars, and leaders, all speaking my name with a kind of reverence my own parents had never once shown me, and as the laughter and conversation swirled around the room like champagne bubbles rising to the surface, I took a quiet step back into an alcove near the marble columns where the noise dulled just enough to breathe, but my moment of stillness was shattered when my clutch buzzed with a familiar vibration, and I glanced down to see that my father was calling me again through FaceTime, and for reasons I could not even explain to myself, I accepted it, and his face appeared on the screen slick with sweat, his tie crooked, his voice breathless and accusing, like I had somehow betrayed him by becoming exactly what I said I would be, and before I could say a word, he launched into an angry ramble demanding to know why I had not told them the ceremony was going to be such a spectacle, why I had made them look like fools in front of their friends and church community, why I had let the bishop find out through television. Instead of telling them directly, and I stood there silent watching, the panic spread across his face like a stain, because what he did not realize was that I had told them again and again, and they had not listened, and now they wanted to rewrite history because the world was watching, and the camera were rolling, but the truth could not be edited. The truth was they chose not to be there. They chose to prioritize facials and brunch over their daughter being sworn in by the Vice President of the United States. And when he said, "We are on our way, we chartered a flight, we will be in Washington in 2 hours," I told him clearly and without hesitation that it was too late because this floor was under federal lockdown for security, and the guest list had been finalized and cleared by the FBI 3 weeks ago, and if they showed up unannounced, they would be treated like any other security risk, and marshals would detain them for trespassing. And as I panned my camera around the room to show the Secret Service agents stationed near the entrance, I heard my mother's voice shrieking in the background, insisting that I let them in because we are your family, but I did not flinch. I simply told them to go back to the spa and enjoy the resort they had picked over their own child, and I ended the call and tucked the phone away without another thought, and turned back toward the reception floor, where I was needed not as a daughter, but as a judge, and in that same hour back at the Delta Sky Club. Martha's Vineyard Airport, my parents and sister sat surrounded by designer luggage and shame as the televisions around the lounge played clip after clip of the swearing. In ceremony, and news anchors praised my journey from humble beginnings to historic appointment while pointing out that my family was notably absent, and Desmond slumped in a leather chair, his eyes glued to the screen where my face stood next to the vice president. And under the headline that read "Youngest Federal Judge in the Southern District of New York," Patris's phone would not stop ringing with calls from church members, friends, and local community leaders, all asking the same thing: where were you? And she stumbled through lies about flight delays and private jets. But the damage had already been done, and no excuse could cover the truth because the image was too powerful, too permanent, and the narrative too complete. They had not been there because they did not believe it mattered, and now they were learning in real time how wrong they had been, and while they sat there spinning in a storm of disbelief and panic, my sister Kesha sat angrily typing into her phone, desperate to find some mistake, some correction, some alternate explanation, but instead she found article after article, video after video headlines, calling me a rising star, a symbol of what was possible when hard work meets purpose. And every one of those headlines felt like a slap across her face because her entire life had been about being the chosen one, the favored daughter, the golden child, and now the world was talking about the daughter. They left behind the daughter who did not bring a husband or a diamond ring to the table, but brought the law itself, and for the first time in her life she looked down at her designer outfit and her vacation drink and realized it meant nothing in the face of power that had been earned and not married in. But the one who truly felt the ground shift was Brad, because he saw something they did not understand, those 4 letters beneath my name, SDN. Why, and he knew exactly what they meant. He knew that courtroom was not just a place of prestige, but a battlefield where white-collar crime was dismantled with precision and authority, and he knew that if I was sitting on that bench, it meant I had access to every case, every sealed document, every federal probe, including the ones circling his name and his shells. Companies, and suddenly, the man who had laughed at my government job was sweating through his designer shirt in the bathroom stall of the airport, trying to breathe through the rising panic. And when he called his attorney, the voice on the other end was not calm or comforting, but sharp and serious, and said, "Yes, Brad, she is real. She has jurisdiction, and yes, if your name is on anything, she can see it." And Brad's legs buckled under him as he tried to process how the woman he had once called boring and unimportant was now the biggest threat to his entire financial empire, and he splashed cold water on his face, trying to quiet the storm inside him, but nothing could stop the truth from closing in because my gavel was now within striking distance. And the man who had fooled my family was about to be unmasked by the daughter they dismissed, and back at the Brooks family, home miles away, Desmond paced the living room floor like a man walking the edge of a cliff, while Petrus sat scrolling through the phone, silently calculating how many of their friends had seen the news, and Kesha stood in the kitchen screaming about how unfair it all was, how I had ruined her weekend, how I was trying to steal the spotlight from her marriage, but none of them saw what was coming. They were too busy nursing their pride to realize they were standing on a sinking ship, because Brad was no longer trying to save them. He was trying to escape, and that night as they sat around the grand dining table in their mansion, Baldwin Hills, eating a meal none of them could taste, Brad began laying the groundwork for one final con, and he slid a document across the table toward Desmond, saying it was a confidential opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime investment, with a guaranteed 200% return. And as he spoke, his words flowed like honey smooth, convincing, promising redemption, and Desmond, who had spent the whole day being humiliated in front of neighbors and strangers, looked at that paper like it was a ticket back to relevance, and Petrus, who had spent years parading her white son-in law through church galas and garden parties, saw a chance to restore her crown. And even when Kesha asked if it was too risky, Brad just smiled and said, "Trust me, this is how real power plays are made." And so Desmond picked up the pen and signed away the deed to the house, the retirement savings, the legacy he had once hoped passed down. And as the ink dried, Brad smiled not with love, but with calculation, because he knew he had everything he needed to disappear before the sun rose and leave them behind in the rubble of their own greed. But what he did not know was that I had already seen the file, I had already opened the red folder marked confidential, and inside I had seen his name and the wire transfers and the shell corporations, and most importantly I had seen the signatures of my parents sitting right there at the top of the investor list. And my stomach turned, because they had chosen him again. They had bet their future on a man who bought spa days instead of seeing their daughter become a judge, and now that choice would cost them everything, because the law does not care about regret, it only cares about proof, and the evidence was clear and overwhelming. And in that moment I did not hesitate. I signed the arrest warrant with a hand that did not shake, and when the assistant U.S. attorney asked if I wanted to make a call to warn them, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Follow procedure, no delays, no special treatment, and make sure the press is there. If they want attention, let us give them a show they will never forget." The grandfather clock in the hallway of the Brooks estate chimed 12 times sharp and slow, each gong echoing through the lavish silence of a house that had no idea it was about to be torn apart. And inside the dining room, beneath a glimmering chandelier that once symbolized legacy and wealth, Brooks family sat in tense silence as a mountain of papers lay sprawled across the table. Mortgage agreements, investment contracts, power of attorney forms, all lined up like dominoes, waiting for the inevitable push. And Brad stood at the head of the table with a glass of wine in one hand and a fount and pen in the other, his shirt collar open, his expression grave but persuasive as he looked at Desmond and Petrus and told them the window of opportunity was closing. And if they did not wire the money within the next 15 minutes, they would lose the deal of a lifetime. And Kesha sat beside him, her nails tapping against her empty wine glass, eyes flicking from her father to her husband like a child watching a magic trick about to go wrong, while Desmond gripped the pen and stared at the signature line of the deed to his house, the very house he had spent 3 decades paying off, and where he had once imagined walking his grandchildren through the front door. And Petrus reached out her hand, pale and trembling, and whispered, "Maybe we should wait, maybe we should call someone, maybe we should ask Nia to look at this." And before she could finish, Kesha slammed her hand against the table, making the crystalware jump, and her voice cracked with fury as she shouted, "How dare you even say her name after what she did to us, after she humiliated us, after she locked us out of her own ceremony and made us look like fools on national television." And she turned to her mother with eyes burning, saying, "You always believed in Nia. You always said she was the smart one. Well, Brad is my husband, and if you do not sign this, you are telling me you do not trust me." And Petrus looked at her daughter, the one she had protected, pampered, and paraded for years, and saw the same desperation she once wore when chasing respect from the country club. And so she nodded slowly and folded and said, "I trust you." And Desmond looked at his wife, his daughter, his white son, in law, and at the memory of the neighbor who had mocked him yesterday about missing the most important moment in his daughter's life, and the words of television anchor calling Nia a self-made icon played again in his mind, and his pride curdled into spite, and he picked up the pen and signed his name once, then again and again, until every document was inked with finality, and Patris followed shakily, and when it was done Brad did not smile. He simply pulled the papers toward him, opened his banking app, and with a few flicks of his thumb transferred $500,000 into an account that would never bear their name again. And as the confirmation screen blinked green, Brad let out a breath that sounded like relief but tasted like betrayal, and he looked down at Desmond and whispered, "It is done. Go to bed. Tomorrow everything changes." And he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the smell of wine and the cold of consequences. And across the city I sat at my desk inside the courthouse, the red digits of the clock glowing. 12:15, and I knew that by the time the sun came up federal agents would be on their way to my family's home with warrants in hand and tactical vests strapped tight, because the crime was complete, the wire transfer was logged, and there would be no more warnings. And yet, even with everything signed and sealed, a small part of me still wanted to try one last time to stop them from falling completely into the pit they had dug with such arrogant hands. And so I picked up the phone and called the landline at the house, and it rang 4 times before my father answered with a drunken cheer, announcing that I had reached the headquarters of the Brooks Empire. And I closed my eyes and took a breath and told him that I needed him to listen, and I could not explain how I knew, but that he had to stop whatever Brad was doing, and he needed to freeze the accounts and not sign or transfer a single dollar. And for a moment there was silence, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he would hear me. But then he laughed, not kindly but with venom, and said he knew I would call because I was jealous, because I could not stand that my sister was going to be richer than me, and that my robe and my gavel and my little job meant nothing in the face of real money. And I said, "Dad, this is not a game, this is a federal investigation." And he shouted back that Brad was a genius and I was a bitter spinster trying to sabotage their success. And then he said the words that sealed their fate. He said, "You are too late, Judge Brooks. We already signed. The transfer went through 10 minutes ago, and in 30 days I am going to buy the building you live in and evict you just to watch you cry." And then he hung up, and I sat there in my chambers, the silence broken only by the distant wail of sirens as I whispered, "No one. I tried to save you, but you would not listen." And across town Brad was tiptoeing through the Brooks mansion like a ghost in the early hours of the morning, his Toomey suitcase in one hand and his escape plan in the other, and he did not glance at Kesha sleeping in the bed they once shared, or at the documents still sitting on the dining room table like gravestones. He only cared about the Aston Martin parked in the garage, the same one he bought with the first round of stolen pension funds. And he moved with precision and intent, knowing every step, every creak in the floor. And he slipped into the driver's seat, loaded the suitcase into the passenger side, and pressed the garage door opener slowly, inch by inch. The door rose, revealing the driveway and the edge of his freedom, but before he could reverse, the entire world exploded into white light. Blinding floodlights cut through the darkness like divine punishment, and voices boomed through megaphones ordering him to exit the vehicle and step onto the ground, and Brad panicked, fumbling for the handle. But it was too late. The garage side door burst open, and federal agents flooded in, dragging him from the seat, slamming him onto the cold concrete, slapping cold steel cuffs around his wrists, and pressing a knee into his back as his breath came in short, dusty gasps. And inside the house lights turned on, doors flew open, and Desmond and Patris came running out in silk pajamas, screaming in confusion, as Kesha followed wrapped in a robe and shouting, "What is going on? What is happening?" And Desmond tried to reach for Brad, yelling, "Get off my son!" in law, but no one listened, and Brad did not look at them with gratitude or apology. He looked at them with the pure rage of a man betrayed by the very fools who enabled him. And as the sun began to rise over the Brooks estate, the house became a crime scene, and FBI agents stormed through drawers, emptied boxes, confiscated laptops, and stacked evidence, while Desmond stood in the middle of his once proud home, trembling and asking, "What have I done?" And an agent stepped forward and told him that The $500,000 transfer was not an investment but an illegal contribution to a laundering scheme, and the money had been frozen by the Treasury, and since Desmond had signed everything voluntarily and handed over ownership of the property, he was now technically trespassing in a federal crime scene, and Patris collapsed with a scream not of pain, but of realization, and Desmond knelt beside her whispering her name. But no comfort came because their empire had fallen, and Kesha stood by the window staring at the Aston Martin being hooked to a tow truck, screaming that it was hers, that the ring on her finger was real, that Brad had bought it for $50,000, but the agent who stood beside her just laughed and said the car was leased and the payments were 3 months behind, and the ring was fake, a costume replica bought in bulk, and if she kept wearing it her finger would turn green. And Kesha stared at the ring, eyes wide, as the truth hit her for the first time, that everything she had believed in, everything she had flaunted, was just cheap glitter covering an empty core, and the Brooks estate was locked and sealed, and the neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering that the fall of a family so proud and so loud had finally come. And I sat in my chambers watching the reports come in, not with joy, but with clarity, because justice was not supposed to feel warm, it was supposed to feel true, and the truth was my family had betrayed me long before I had ever stepped into that courtroom, and now the law was doing what I could not, saving them from themselves. The news cycle was brutal by morning. The footage from the courthouse had gone viral, not just a clip, but the entire walk I had taken in silence alone, dressed in my federal robe, stepping into history without a single family member at my side, was now playing on daytime shows, primetime discussions, and podcast breakdowns, and everyone had something to say about it. The headlines ranged from powerful to pitiful, from historic judge breaks chains of generational trauma to heartbreaking video of new federal judge walking alone. And while many people applauded the dignity and grace, others asked questions they had no answers to. Where was her family? Why was no one there? What could they have done to be absent on the most important day of her life? And even though I had said nothing to the press, had granted no interviews or written any statements, the silence only made the story louder and louder, and soon the speculation turned to investigation. Online sleuths uncovered pictures from old family reunions, public donation records from the Brooks estate, Kesha's luxury bridal shower photos, and even campaign donations made by Brad over the last several years. And someone somewhere noticed the discrepancy between Brad's lavish lifestyle and his official income, and the dominoes began to fall faster than anyone could control. And then a former co-worker from Brad's previous finance job posted a thread on social media that gained over 3 million views in one day, saying he had warned the Brooks family about Brad in 2016 after discovering falsified investment statements and doctored emails, and that Brad had been quietly let go instead of reported to authorities. And from there, the internet exploded. The FBI field office received over 200 calls in 48 hours citing suspicious activity, all tied back to Brad and the Brooks family trust, and I had nothing to do with it. I had said nothing to spark it or stir it, but the world had eyes and the world was watching, and people began to draw their own conclusions, and by the end of the week the Brooks estate was not only under investigation, but also under surveillance. News vans parked 2 blocks away, neighbors whispering behind windows, and drone footage catching glimpses of luxury cars and private tennis lessons that no longer fit the narrative. And it did not take long for the IRS to get involved, and soon subpoenas were being drafted for Kesha, for Brad, for Desmond, and Patris. And yet, even in the middle of the storm, my parents did not call, they did not text, they did not reach out. Instead, they retreated deeper into denial. Acting like this was just another media cycle to wait out. And Brad continued to promise them that his lawyers would make it all go away, and Kesha clung to those words like gospel. But it was Patris who finally broke on the 7th day, when she opened a certified letter from the federal court ordering her to appear for questioning regarding asset transfers involving pension accounts that had mysteriously gone dry, and she dropped the envelope on the marble floor of the foyer, her legs giving out beneath her, and Desmond rushed to catch her, but could not stop the shaking in his own hands, and when he picked up the papers and read them, his face went pale Because for the first time he realized they were not victims in a bad business deal, they were co-conspirators in something they barely understood, and over the next few days the house that once echoed with parties and laughter now sat in silence, the blinds always drawn, the doors always locked. Kesha pacing like a caged animal, yelling at Brad to fix it, and Brad yelling back that it was her fault, they had trusted too many people, that someone must have leaked something, and all the while the walls closed in, and then came the press conference, the one held by the United States Attorney for District, with a bold blue banner behind her, and a wall of agents standing firm, and I watched from my office as she read aloud the charges pending against Brad, including fraud, embezzlement money, laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft, and the names of the shell companies he had created to funnel money from retirement accounts to his personal offshore accounts. And then came the shocker. They announced that they were investigating additional parties for knowingly facilitating these transfers through personal accounts and family trusts. And though she did not name names, it was clear who she meant, and reporters went wild asking if the family of the newly appointed federal judge was involved, and if I had known anything, and the attorney paused before answering, and simply said the judge has fully cooperated and is not under investigation. She was unaware of these activities, and not a subject of this case, and I exhaled not from relief but from sorrow, because no matter how clean my name was, the stain was already there, and I knew it would follow me for the rest of my career. And just like that, the phone calls began not from family but from former classmates, law school friends, colleagues, senators, judges, everyone asking if I was all right, if I needed support, if I needed legal counsel or security detail, or just someone to listen. And I thanked them all, politely declined the help, and sat at my desk as the sun set behind the courthouse walls, and felt the weight of my robe, the first time not as an honor but as armor. And later that night, when the wind howled outside my window, I received a voicemail from Kesha, her voice strained and high-pitched as she asked if I was happy now, if I enjoyed watching our family be torn apart, and she screamed that I had always been jealous of her, that I had always wanted to be the center of attention, and now I got what I wanted, and she hung up without saying goodbye. And then came another voicemail from Patris, this one quieter, more broken, asking if I could forgive her, if I could please tell the truth, that she never meant hurt me, that she just wanted both her daughters to be happy, and that she was scared she was going to lose everything, and she needed someone to believe her. And the final voicemail was from Desmond, not angry, not sad, just confused, as he asked, when did it all go wrong, and why had I never come to him? When I felt alone, and I sat in the darkness listening to their voices, each one like a ghost of a family that once was, and I did not cry, not because I did not want to, but because the tears had already been shed years ago, when they chose to ignore me, when they chose to invest in lies instead of love. And the next morning, as headlines announced the grand jury proceedings and Brad's indictment, Desmond and Patris were served with new subpoenas, and Kesha was escorted out of her gym in front of a crowd of reporters screaming questions she could not answer, and Brad remained in federal custody, denied bail due to flight risk and fraudulent passports, and I remained at the courthouse reviewing cases, issuing rulings, keeping my head down while the storm passed over my family. And I never said a word to the press, not because I was afraid, but because I knew the truth did not need my voice. It had already found its own. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow unraveling of a perfectly stitched lie, each thread pulling at the next, until the fabric of their family pride began to fray beyond repair. As the headlines kept cycling, the public grew more curious, and investigative journalists began to dig through campaign donations, charity ledgers, social media photos, tax filings, anything they could get their hands on, and each finding added a new layer to the growing narrative that Brad was not a financial genius, but a carefully packaged fraud. And as more people spoke up, anonymously or otherwise, authorities built their case one shell company at a time, while the Brooks household transformed into a fortress of paranoia and panic, with security cameras now installed at every corner, mail checked twice a day, and phones tapped just in case. And even though I had no part in it, even though I was Miles away, sitting in my chambers each morning listening to opening statements and writing legal opinions, my name was still part of the media frenzy, as if my success and their downfall were two parts of the same coin, and while I carried myself with grace in court behind closed doors, I was tired of pretending. Their silence did not hurt. The longer they remained quiet, the louder the message became that their pride had never been in me. It had always been in what I could do for their image, and now that I stood alone as a federal judge, they had nothing left to claim, and I began to understand the depth of that emptiness. It was not just absence, it was a hollow echo of what family should have been, and it followed me everywhere, especially on the day my alma mater invited me to deliver the keynote address at their commencement ceremony. It was the first time I stood before a crowd, not just as a guest or graduate, but as someone they admired, and I looked out into the sea of black caps and eager eyes, and saw hope and hunger and ambition, and it reminded me of who I had been before the years chipped away at my belief in love and kin. And when I spoke, I did not mention my title or the accolade. I did not name-drop my law school or the judges who had mentored me. Instead, I talked about integrity, about doing the right thing even when no one clapped, even when it meant standing alone, especially then. And I saw students nodding, parents clapping, professors wiping tears, and it filled something in me that my family never could. And when the speech went viral the next day, another wave of attention followed, this time not about Brad, not about the scandal, but about me and how I had become a symbol for strength and independence and resilience. And still not a word from Desmond or Patris or Kesha. Not even a short congratulations, and I wondered if it was stubbornness or shame or both that kept them from picking up the phone. But I did not chase closure anymore. I had learned that some people only show up for the photo, not the fight, and I was no longer interested in being their decoration. And yet life did not slow down. In fact, it moved faster than ever, with interviews, book offers, nonprofit invitations all pouring in, as my name became shorthand for surviving betrayal with grace. And somewhere in that blur of new beginnings, I received an email from an old mentor, Judge Harris, who had once told me in 2007 that the hardest thing about power was choosing how and when to use it, and he wrote that he had watched everything unfold with pride and sadness, that he knew I had not wanted any of this, but had handled it with a dignity many twice my age could not, and he ended the message with 4 simple words: "Welcome to real freedom." And I sat with those words for a long time, wondering what they truly meant. And one morning, as I stood in my kitchen pouring tea into a chipped mug, I realized that freedom was not just about walking away, it was about staying gone even when the door creaked open and a voice begged you to come back. And that voice came sooner than I expected, in the form of a letter from Patris, not an email, not a voicemail, but a handwritten note sealed with gold trim like something out of a wedding invitation. And in it she wrote that she had made mistakes, that she had let pride blind her, that she missed her daughter and wanted to make things right. And it was so carefully worded, so rehearsed, it almost made me laugh. But then I remembered the girl I had once been, who would have read that letter and folded under its weight, and I knew that girl no longer lived here. So I wrote back in plain black ink, "I am not angry, I am not hurt, I am not waiting, I wish you healing, but I will not return." And I mailed it without signing it, just initials, nothing more. And in doing so I felt something shift, a quiet liberation, like laying down a burden I had carried too long. And the next day, when my phone rang with an unknown number, I let it go to voicemail, and later listened to Kesha crying, begging me to stop punishing them, saying Brad had been arrested again, this time for violating terms of his house arrest, that their accounts were frozen, that she was losing everything. And I deleted it without replying, because I had nothing left to give. And still the world kept turning, the sun kept rising, and I kept showing up for my job, not because I had to, but because I chose to, because despite everything, I still believed in justice, in fairness, in second chances, those who truly wanted them. And one afternoon after court, I walked to the little bookstore around the corner, the one I used to go to during law school, when I needed a break from case law and caffeine, and I picked up a novel about family and grief and strength, and the owner recognized me from news and said, "You're the one who walked in alone and made history." And I smiled and said, "I'm the one who walked in." And that night I read that novel cover to cover, tears falling not from sadness, but from release. And I realized I did not need them to be proud of me, because I had finally learned to be proud of myself, and that was a kind of victory no robe, no gavel, no headline could ever match. I never thought the quiet after a storm could feel louder than the chaos itself, but the days that followed that letter from Patris became a strange mix of calm and discomfort, like standing in a room where the music had just stopped, and everyone was pretending they had not been dancing, and I went back to my routine, writing opinions, hearing cases, making rulings, but something in me had changed, and not in the dramatic movie type of way, but in the subtle kind, the one where you blink and suddenly realize you no longer crave the apology you once thought would heal you. And while I focused on law and fairness, the world around me continued to turn headlines, faded reporters moved on, and the Brooks family drama finally took a back seat to newer scandals in politics and celebrity circles. But behind closed doors, their downfall was still unraveling, and the final straw came when Brad was sentenced, not just for fraud, but for violating multiple terms of his supervised release with evidence that he had tried to transfer funds into offshore accounts. And the court documents painted a story so twisted it almost seemed fictional, but it was not, it was real, and it was humiliating, and the judge overseeing his case made no effort to hide his disappointment, calling it one of the most arrogant acts of financial deceit he had seen in 2 decades. And with that verdict, Brad was taken into custody again, but this time there would be no bail, no press conferences, no expensive lawyers smiling for cameras, just silence, cold walls, and the weight of everything he had built crumbling down with it. And Kesha was forced to sell her shares in the family business, which had also come under fire for fraudulent tax claims, and Desmond and Patris, who had once been invited to galas and fundraisers, were now whispered about in country clubs and church gatherings, and it seemed poetic almost how quickly the social ladder turned its back on them when the truth became public. And even then they did not reach out, not a word, not a text, not a call. And at that point I stopped wondering why and started asking myself what peace actually looked like for me, because revenge had never been the goal. I never wanted them to fall. I just wanted to rise without their weight, and now that I needed to decide what to do with the silence, and oddly enough, the answer came not from anyone I knew, but from a woman named Clara, who stopped me outside the courthouse one morning. She was in her 60s, neatly dressed, and she said, "Judge, I watched your hearing, and I cried because I saw my daughter in you. She passed away last year, and I just wanted you to know that you remind me of her strong, quiet kind. And not waiting for anyone to validate you." And then she hugged me before I could even reply and walked away, and I stood there stunned by the power of a stranger's kindness, and it hit me that the validation I had always wanted from Patris or Desmond was never mine to earn, it was theirs to give, and they had chosen not to, and that was on them, not me. And for the first time I felt a weight lift, not because someone finally apologized, but because I finally stopped needing it. And with that shift came new clarity in how I approached everything, including my role on the bench. I started mentoring young lawyers, especially women, especially those who looked like me, who came from places that the law often overlooked or misunderstood, and I poured myself into guiding them, helping them navigate the politics, the expectations, the pressure, and I found so much purpose in that, in being the person I had once needed when I was climbing alone, and my chambers began to fill with letters not from elites or media, but from students, from mothers, from women in shelters who watched my interviews or read my rulings and found hope. And one letter in particular stayed with me. It was from a teenage girl named Mia, whose older brother had been sentenced in my courtroom, and she wrote that while she hated the system, she saw something different in me, that I listened, that I looked at people like they mattered, and that because of me, she wanted to become a lawyer to fight the same system that took her brother. And I kept that letter in my drawer, rereading it every time the silence from my own family tried to echo back. And one rainy afternoon, just as the city lights flickered and the streets reflected the sky, I found myself standing in front of the house I grew up in. It was not planned. I had taken a different route home from court, and my driver made a wrong turn, and there it was, the red brick, the white shutters, the porch where I had once sat reading under the summer sun, and the windows where shadows of the past seemed to flicker. And for a brief moment I wondered if they would open the door, if they would see me and say something, anything, but I did not knock, I did not linger. I just stood there, took a deep breath, and walked away, and that felt like closure, not the cinematic kind with tears and hugs, but the quiet kind, the one that does not need witnesses to be real. And as I drove back through the city, I looked at the buildings, the streets, the people, all moving, all living, and I realized I was part of something bigger than pain. I was part of a world that kept spinning even when hearts broke and families disappointed, and I chose in that moment to not just survive, but to thrive, not in spite of my past, but because I had learned to carry it without letting it carry me. And the next day I accepted an invitation to teach a guest course at my old law school, and when I stood in front of those students and began to speak, I did not talk about the fall of the Brooks family, or the media frenzy, or even the letters I had received. I talked about how power is not about volume or title, but about presence, about choosing to stay when it is easier to run, about choosing to speak when silence is safe, and choosing to walk alone when no one claps and they listened not just with ears, but with hearts and eyes. And I knew then that every ounce of my journey, even the painful parts, had brought me to this, and that was enough. The morning I walked into the law school to teach my guest lecture, the air felt different, not just in the way the autumn breeze brushed across my face, but in how light my footsteps felt, as if I had finally shed the last layer of something I had carried for too long. And the students gathered quickly, all eyes focused, notebooks open, some already typing on laptops, while others waited quietly, and I began not with a quote or a dramatic introduction, but with a question: what does justice mean to you? And the room paused like time itself had taken a breath, and then slowly hands began to rise, and the answers came layered: and honest, fairness, truth, accountability, consequences, but also restoration, hope, mercy. And I listened deeply, knowing that this generation of lawyers would not only inherit the system, but would have the power to change it. And when the lecture ended, many stayed back asking about clerkships, judicial temperament, dealing with bias, and I saw in their questions the same hunger I once had to be seen, to belong, to lead. And later that day, while walking back to my car, I received a call from the courthouse about a high-profile case that had been expedited to my docket, a civil rights matter involving police misconduct, and I agreed to take it, knowing it would bring scrutiny and pressure, but also knowing that this was why I wore the robe, to handle the weight that came with decisions that rippled beyond the courtroom. And the case unfolded quickly, and the city watched. Testimonies revealed systemic failures, cover-ups, and deep wounds in communities already fractured, and I made sure the courtroom was open to the public, that everyone who wanted to witness the process could. And during the proceedings, I noticed a familiar face in the back row, Clara, the woman who had once told me I reminded her of her daughter, and she sat silently, hands folded, eyes sharp, never missing a word. And in the final week of hearings, when closing arguments wrapped and the room emptied slowly, she approached me again, not as a grieving mother this time, but as a citizen. She said, "Thank you for not flinching," and walked away again without asking for anything. And it struck me how people can see you fully even when they barely know you. And in that moment I felt more grounded than ever. And after the verdict was delivered with a ruling that held the department accountable and mandated reforms, the backlash began, and so did the support. Some called me biased, others called me brave. And as always, I ignored the noise, focusing instead on the law, on precedent, on clarity. And in the middle of all that, I received an email from a journalist who had followed my journey from the nomination hearings. She asked if I would be open to a feature, not about the Brooks scandal, but about my work, about what I had done since the robe. And I said yes, not for attention, but because I wanted the narrative to shift from who abandoned me to what I built. And the article ran under the title "The Bench," the backbone, and it highlighted my rulings, my mentorship, and the letter from Mia, the teenager who wanted to become a lawyer. And something unexpected happened after that. The dean of the law school reached out and offered me a permanent position to teach one course each semester, focusing on judicial ethics and courtroom equity. And after thinking it over, I accepted, not because I wanted to slow down, but because I wanted to plant seeds. And a few weeks into that new role, while grading midterms, I got a call from Jasmine, her number still saved, though I had not used it in years, and I stared at the screen before answering, unsure what version of her I would hear. And her voice was soft, hesitant, like someone stepping onto thin ice. She said, "Hey, I saw your article, and I just wanted to say I am proud of you, and I am sorry for how things went down." And I did not interrupt. I let her finish, and then I said thank you and asked how she was, and she told me about her daughter, about starting therapy, and about how seeing me had made her realize she could also rise from pain. And we did not talk long, maybe 15 minutes, but it was the first real conversation we had in years, and it felt honest, not forced. And after we hung up, I sat in silence for a while, thinking about how healing does not always come wrapped in forgiveness, but sometimes just in understanding. And days later, I received a package at the courthouse with no return address, and inside was a small photo of my swearing imprinted on canvas with a handwritten note that read, "You did not need us there because you were always enough." And I did not know who sent it, but I placed it on my bookshelf where I could see it every day as a quiet reminder, and life settled into a rhythm, not perfect, not without challenges, but stable. And one evening, while walking through the neighborhood, I bumped into Patris outside a grocery store, and it was one of those moments where everything slows down, where you have a split second to decide how to react. And she looked at me, eyes wide, lips parting as if to speak, but she said nothing, and I nodded politely and walked past, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say, and I knew that even if she wanted to explain now, it would not change the choices she made. And that was the last time I saw her, and I did not dwell on it, because some chapters end without punctuation, and years later, as I stood at a graduation ceremony giving a keynote speech to a new batch of law students, I looked out at the crowd and spotted Mia in the front row, now a law clerk, soon to be attorney. And when she saw me, her smile widened, and she gave a small wave, and it felt like everything had come full circle. Like the scars had become stars, like the girl who once sat alone at her own ceremony had become the woman who now inspired others to stand tall. And that was the legacy I wanted, not revenge, not validation, but a path wide enough for others to walk through with less fear and more hope. And when the applause ended and I stepped off the stage, I knew without doubt that my story had never really been about who was missing, but about who showed up and who I became because of it, and that was more than enough. After that unexpected conversation with Jasmine, I noticed how quiet my evenings had become again, not empty, just quiet, like a page waiting for the next line to be written. And my days were still full: hearings, research, mentoring. But when the sun dipped below the city skyline and the courthouse emptied, I would often walk the long way home, taking in the sounds of a place that once felt too loud and now seemed to hum in rhythm with me. And one Friday evening, I passed by the old bookstore I used to frequent back in law school, and out of instinct I walked in, greeted by the familiar creak of the wooden floor and the scent of old paper and time, and I browsed the aisles without looking for anything in particular until I stumbled upon a biography of a female judge from the early 1900s, someone I had once written a paper about, and I bought it not for nostalgia, but to remind myself that women like her walked so women like me could stand. And later that weekend I received a handwritten letter in the mail with no return address, just my name written neatly on the envelope, and inside was a single sheet that read, "You are doing exactly what they said you could not." And I sat there holding that paper longer than I should have, thinking about how even silent support can echo loudly in the right moments. And the following Monday brought a new case that would again draw attention: a dispute between a public school district and several families regarding equitable access to special education programs. And though it lacked the drama of criminal trials, it carried the kind of quiet gravity that could reshape policy and precedent. And I approached it like I approached everything, with care, precision, and deep empathy. And during one of the hearings, a woman testified about how her son had been denied services repeatedly, and she looked me in the eye, not with anger but with exhaustion, and she said, "I just want someone to hear me," and I assured her that I had and I would. And by the time the ruling was issued months later, requiring sweeping reforms across the district, I received an anonymous note that simply said, "Thank you for listening." And those were the moments that mattered, not the headlines, not the interviews, but the moments where justice felt like healing. And soon after that case, I got an invitation from a National Legal Association to speak at their annual conference, and though I had declined such things before this time, I said yes, and the event was held in a grand hall filled with hundreds of legal professionals. And when I stepped on stage, I spoke not about case law or doctrine, but about silence and how often the law forgets to listen. And when I finished, the room stood in quiet applause, not loud, not performative, just honest. And later that evening, as I returned to my hotel room, there was a knock at the door, and when I opened it, I found a small envelope slipped under the frame. It contained a photo of my law school graduation with a sticky note that read, "From someone who remembers," and that same night I received a voicemail from an unknown number. It was my father. I had not heard his voice in years, but I recognized it instantly. He said, "I saw you on the news, and I do not expect you to answer, but I just wanted to say I was wrong," and that he hung up. No explanations, no excuses, just that. And I sat by the window listening to the city outside, wondering why the apologies always came when they were no longer needed. And the next day, while preparing to return home, I received an email from my clerk about a new petition on my desk involving an incarcerated woman seeking a retrial based on new DNA evidence, and I knew that case would become another storm because it implicated officers who were still active and a prosecutor who had since been promoted. But again, I did not hesitate. I read every page, met with both sides, and ensured that every voice was heard, and when I eventually ruled in favor of a retrial, I expected backlash, but what I got instead was silence, as if the system itself was waiting to see what would happen next. And then a week later, I received an invitation to be interviewed on a legal podcast, one known for its frank discussions and sharp questions. And during the recording, the host asked me, "What drives you to keep showing up?" And I said, "Because I remember what it felt like when no one showed up for me." And when the episode aired, the messages poured in from strangers, from students, from women of color, from men who had daughters and sisters and mothers-in-law, and for the first time I felt like the robe I wore was not just fabric, but a flag, a signal that the room had changed. And as autumn turned to winter, I was asked to sit on a judicial panel to evaluate new ethics guidelines, and during one of those sessions I met Judge Emery, an older gentleman known for his stoic rulings and academic writings, and during a break he pulled me aside and said, "I read your opinion on the district education case, and it reminded me why I joined the bench decades ago," and then he added, "I hope they never silence you." Kind of clarity, and I realized that influence does not always come from shaking the system, but from studying it. And then one snowy morning, as I prepared for a full day of hearings, I got a call from a young woman named Annika, who introduced herself as the niece of one of the court staff. She said she was studying pre-law and had followed my career for a school project, and she asked if she could shadow me for a day, and though it was not typical, I agreed, and she arrived the next week, wide-eyed, a notebook in hand. And by the end of the day, she said quietly, "I thought judges were supposed to be cold, but you're kind," and I told her the two are not opposites, and she smiled and asked if I thought she could do it too, and I said, "Not only can you do it, but the bench will need people like you." And the following week, her aunt delivered a thank you card with a single sentence she has not stopped talking about that day, and I realized once again that the work is not just in the rulings or the headlines, but in the moments no one records. And as the year came to a close, I was invited to speak at the Judicial Review Board, a closed-door session with some of the highest members of the judiciary. And when I walked into that room, I noticed something subtle but powerful. There were more women, more people of color, more younger faces than I had seen in years. And when it was my turn to speak, I told them that justice should not depend on how loud someone can shout, but on how deeply someone listens. And when I finished, a senior judge stood and simply nodded, and that moment held more weight than any medal. And as I returned to my chambers that evening, I found a letter waiting on my desk. It was from Jasmine again, this time longer, more reflective. She spoke about her own journey, about how therapy had helped her reconnect with her past, about how becoming a mother had made her reconsider the silence she once accepted, and she ended with a line that stayed with me: "You taught me that showing up for someone can start with showing up for yourself." And I wrote her back, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge the growth. And that night I stood at my window watching the city lights flicker, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, not just peace, but presence, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and that was enough. I sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the closed laptop screen, as if it held the answers to everything I had been avoiding. The ache in my chest grew tighter with each beat, like a silent warning that something inside me was about to break. The room around me felt too quiet, too clean, too far from the noise and chaos that used to surround my life back when I still believed in family and second chances and love that healed, not hurt. I thought about what my sister said to me during our last phone call, her voice still echoing in my head as if it had never left, that tone filled with judgment and disappointment and something colder than distance. It was the way she said it, like she had never known me, like I was the outsider knocking on a door that would never be opened again. I rose to my feet and began pacing the room, each step grounding me, reminding me that I had made it through worse than this and that I had the power now, not them, not anymore. I opened my phone and scrolled through the missed calls and unread messages, most of them from people who had been silent when I needed them the most, but suddenly found their voices once the press picked up my story and it went viral. I had not asked for headlines or applause, but it came anyway, the kind of fame that does not come with parades or confetti, but with long looks and even longer silences from people who once called themselves your kin. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared out the window. The city below moved on as if nothing had changed, while everything inside me was being rewritten line by line, truth by painful truth. I remembered my father's words from years ago when I told him I was applying for law school. He said it was a waste of money, a waste of time, that I would never make it past the first semester, and if I did it would only be because someone took pity on me. Those words had dug themselves deep into my skin, but instead of killing me, they carved something stronger out of my spine, and now here I was years later, not only a graduate, but a sworn federal judge, and he had not even shown up to witness it. My hands tightened around the glass as I thought about how he had prioritized a golf game over my swearing in ceremony, like it was just another day, just another thing to miss and forget and pretend never mattered. I thought about my mother too, how she had texted me the night before with some excuse about not feeling well, but had posted a photo on social media that same morning, smiling at a brunch table, surrounded by friends none of whom knew or cared, that her daughter was about to take an oath in front of the most respected people in the legal system. I let the anger rise and fall in me like a tide, learning to ride it instead of drown in it. Then I took a breath, a long, deep breath that seemed to pull from the very bottom of my lungs, and I picked up my phone and opened the email draft I had started days ago, addressed to both of them. It was not cruel, bitter, but it was honest, brutally. So I told them how it felt to stand there alone in a room full of strangers and still feel more seen than I ever had in their presence. I told them how I had waited my whole life for their approval, only to realize that their silence was louder than any applause could ever be, and that I did not need it anymore. I told them about the people who had shown up, the mentors, the friends, the colleagues who had held me up and cheered for me and made me feel like I belonged, not because of my blood, but because of my work and my worth. I told them that I forgave them, not for their sake, but for mine, because I could not carry the weight of their disappointment any longer, and I deserved to walk free of it, even if they never understood. I read it once, twice, then pressed send the moment the message disappeared from the screen. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not joy, not relief, but clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else to show up for you and decide to show up for yourself. I stepped away from the table and walked back to the mirror, the same mirror where I had once practiced courtroom speeches in whispering fear, now reflected a woman who no longer needed to pretend. I smiled faintly, not for the world, but for myself, because after everything I had lost and everything I had survived, I was still standing, still rising, and still ready for whatever came next, and that was more than enough. The next morning I woke up with a strange mix of calm and unrest circling inside me, like two rivers crashing against each other beneath still waters. It was the first time in years that I had not woken up to my parents' voices in my head telling me what I should be doing, how I should be living, why I would never be enough today. There was only silence, and that silence felt more sacred than any blessing I had ever been given. I took my time getting ready, the robe of a federal judge still hanging in my closet untouched from yesterday, because I had not decided if I was ready to wear it again. Not yet, not after what it took to earn it, and what it cost to wear it alone. I brewed a strong cup of tea, and opened the blinds, letting the sunlight spill into my apartment, soft and golden, and healing, in a way I had never let it be, before I looked out over the city, the streets already busy, the noise of horns and life weaving their way upward, and I thought about how many people walked around every day with their wounds tucked behind polished shoes and pressed suits, pretending the past had not marked them, pretending they were whole just because they kept moving. I was one of them, and maybe still was, but something had shifted in me after sending that message to my parents. I had not checked for a response, not because I did not care, but because I knew it would not change what had already been broken. Their absence at the ceremony was not just a mistake, it was a choice, and choices come with weight, whether people admit it or not. I sat at my desk and opened my case files, needing something to ground me, to bring me back into the life I had built by myself for myself, the faces of victims, the stories of pain and injustice, the long trails of evidence and doubt. This was the world I understood. The one where truth had value and justice had a name. I spent hours going through the documents, my eyes scanning for inconsistencies, for anything that could help me make a better decision for the people who trusted me to hold power with purpose. By the time the afternoon rolled in, my phone had buzzed several times, but I ignored it until I finally glanced at the screen and saw a text from my cousin Mark. It just said, "Proud of you," followed by a photo from the ceremony. Someone had taken it from behind, capturing me standing tall at the podium, the flag to one side, the oath in my hand, and the judge next to me smiling as he welcomed me into a new chapter. I stared at it for a long time, not because I liked how I looked, but because it reminded me that I had truly been there. I had made it, no matter who had decided not to come. I replied with a simple thank you, and for the first time in a while, I felt like it was enough. I was enough. Later that evening, I received an unexpected call from Judge Simmons, the woman who had mentored me through law school and helped me land my first internship. Her voice was as firm and kind as I remembered, and she congratulated me not just for the appointment, but for the strength I had shown in standing alone. She said she had watched the video of my swearing in that someone had posted online, and it had brought her to tears, not because of the position I had earned, but because of the clarity in my voice. When I spoke the oath, she said she could hear the weight of my journey in every word, and it made her proud beyond measure. I thanked her quietly, tears slipping down my face as I stared out the window again, watching as the sky turned from gold to soft blue tonight. I had not cried during the ceremony, or even after, but now, here in the safety of a voice that had never betrayed me, I let myself feel it all, the ache, the joy, the loneliness, the triumph. It came in waves, slow and honest and long overdue. After we hung up, I sat in silence again, but this time it felt like peace, not punishment. I thought about my younger self, the girl who used to sneak into libraries to read case studies and dream of standing in courtrooms holding her ground while the world doubted her. I wished I could go back and tell her that she was going to be okay, not perfect, not painless, but okay, and maybe that was the greatest victory of all. I got up and pulled the judge's robe from the closet, running my fingers along the fabric. It was heavier than I remembered, thick with meaning and stitched with every hour I had worked, every exam I had passed, every insult I had endured, every time I had kept going when quitting would have been easier. I put it on slowly, letting it fall across my shoulders like armor, not to protect me from the world, but to remind me that I had already faced it and won. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself, not the way my parents saw me or the way the world had tried to define me, but the way I had become, layer by layer, choice by choice, until this version of me stood tall, unbent, unbroken, and fully present. I took a photo, not for anyone else, but for me, a reminder that I had earned this moment, that it was mine no matter who tried to ignore it. And then I walked back to my desk, ready to begin the next chapter, not as their daughter, not as someone seeking approval, but as a woman who had written her own story and dared to believe it was worth telling. The moment I stepped back into my office that Monday morning, I felt different, not like someone who had returned from vacation or someone who was easing back into routine, but like someone who had crossed through a fire and come out not only unburned but hardened. Something had shifted deep within me, and I carried it like invisible armor. I poured myself a cup of black coffee the way I always did, but even that felt heavier now, as if the mug itself knew things would not go back to the way they were. I opened my laptop, and the screen lit up with a wall of unread emails. The notifications kept flooding in like a river that had broken through a dam. Everyone from former classmates to distant acquaintances had seen the viral clip of my solo swearing in ceremony, and now the messages came in waves, people asking what happened, expressing outrage, sending support, and even strangers telling me how much my story resonated with them. I did not respond to most. I could not. I did not have the emotional bandwidth for it. I scrolled through quickly, pausing only at a few names that made my heart ache. My parents had still not reached out, neither had my sister, but that no longer stung the way it had days ago. Their silence felt more like confirmation than confusion. I knew exactly where I stood now, and while that was painful, it was also freeing. A new email caught my eye, one from Judge Alvarez, the woman who had administered my oath. She wrote with warmth and sincerity, saying she had rarely been so moved during a ceremony and wanted me to know that in all her years on the bench she had never seen someone stand so tall alone. Her words humbled me and strengthened me. In the same breath later that day, my assistant Sarah peeked in and told me that a man named Mr. Forrester was in the waiting room and had asked for 5 minutes of my time. I racked my brain for the name, and then remembered he was the journalist who had written that opinion piece 2 years ago about judicial diversity. I told Sarah to send him in. He walked in with a careful respect, as if he knew he was entering a sacred space, and he greeted me with a soft smile before handing me a folder. Inside were printouts of the comments and responses to the article about my ceremony. It had already passed over 100,000 shares, and the discourse it had sparked was astounding. Some people praised my independence, others condemned my family for their absence, and some even debated whether personal lives should factor into public milestones. Mr. Forrester said he wanted to do a follow-up piece, not about my achievements, but about the resilience it took to reach them. He asked if I would be open to an interview in the coming week, and though I was hesitant at first, I agreed, not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted to take back control of the narrative. I would not let my silence be filled by speculation or pity. I would speak my truth, not to shame anyone, but to honor the journey I had taken mostly alone. That evening, as I walked to my car, a light drizzle began to fall. I did not rush. I let it soak into my coat and my hair, the way old memories sometimes soaked into your bones. It reminded me of walking home from school as a child, when my parents would forget to pick me up, and I would pretend it did not bother me back then. I used to tell myself they were busy with important things, that they loved me, but just got distracted. But that night, standing under the soft rain, I let myself admit that being forgotten was never about busyness. It was about priorities, and I had never been theirs truly, not when it mattered, and certainly not now. I drove home in silence, my wipers scraping back and forth like a metronome, keeping time with my thoughts. The house was quiet when I entered, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the wall clock. I placed my keys on the counter and stared at them for a long moment. The smallest objects can sometimes look like anchors, like proof that you exist somewhere, that you matter. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my phone, scrolling through the texts that had come in earlier. One from my college roommate congratulating me, one from my mentor, Judge Hawthorne, saying he had never been prouder, and one from my law school professor, who wrote simply, "You earned this, you always did." I smiled at that last one, because I remembered how she had once told me during a brutal exam week that the law needs people who do not flinch when it gets hard, and I had never flinched, not through undergrad, not through law school, not through the internship rejections or the nights spent studying while others partied, not even through the loneliness of becoming something that my family never truly believed I could be. I pulled up the photo of me standing alone in front of the flag, right hand raised, eyes steady, the judge beside me, and the courtroom nearly empty, and I stared at it until the image blurred from tears, not from sadness, but from release. That photo told the truth, not just about who was there, but about who had always been there. I had been my own witness my own support system, my own cheerleader, and that mattered more than anything else. The next morning I woke up early and went for a run. My shoes hit the pavement with steady rhythm, and the air was crisp with promise. I ran past houses with warm lights glowing behind curtains and wondered if those families understood what I had spent so many years chasing and never catching. I did not envy them, not anymore. I simply acknowledged the difference, the lack, and then I let it go like breath in cold air. I returned home and took a long shower, letting the steam erase whatever ghost still clung to my skin. I had a full docket that day, and I was ready for it. I dressed in my robe, tied it tightly, and looked in the mirror for a long moment. I did not look for flaws or approval. I looked to see if the strength I felt inside showed on the outside, and it did. The courtroom was buzzing. When I entered, a few attorneys stood straighter than usual. A few glanced at me with what might have been newfound respect or perhaps recognition of the fire I carried now. I banged the gavel and began proceedings with a calm and clear voice, and as the morning unfolded, I felt completely at home in my seat behind the bench, where I belonged, where I had always belonged, not because someone had paved the way for me, but because I had built the path with my own hands, one brick, one rejection, one tear at a time. And when the session ended and I walked back to my chambers, I paused for a moment to look back at the empty room, not out of nostalgia, but with a kind of reverence, not for what had been lost, but for what had been claimed. I stood in front of my office window, watching the clouds roll in over the city, as if the sky itself mirrored the heaviness I felt inside. Everything had been moving fast ever since that day in the courtroom, the swearing in the headlines, the endless congratulations from strangers, the applause from people I never knew, all those who called and sent flowers and messages praising what they thought was the proudest moment of my life. And still not a word from my parents. It had been nearly 3 weeks, and they had not reached out, not even once. No voicemail, no text, no card, nothing. And I thought back to how different I had once imagined this moment would be, back in 2005, when I was just a nervous law student, pulling all-nighters and rehearsing moot court arguments in front of the mirror. I used to dream about the day I would become a federal judge, and how my mom would wear her favorite cream blazer and sit with my dad in the front row, clutching tissues while trying not to cry as I raised my hand and took the oath. But instead, on the real day, the row was empty, their seats untouched, and I had walked into that courtroom alone, and walked out alone too, despite all the camera, all the flash, all the handshakes and titles and ribbons. The silence from my own blood echoed louder than anything else. And in those 3 weeks, the silence began to feel like a decision, not a mistake, not an oversight, but a choice, and that hurt more than anything else I had ever faced in my entire life. And yet, despite the pain, I had to keep going. I had to show up every day for work. I had to write opinions, oversee cases, manage staff, keep up the image of strength and poise and power, because that was what the robe demanded from me. No matter how broken I felt inside, no one could see it. No one could know that. Every night I went home and stared at my phone, hoping maybe this time there would be a missed call. Maybe my father would finally get over his pride and just say he was proud, or maybe my mom would send a simple message saying she was sorry, or even just that she saw the ceremony online. But the phone stayed quiet each time, and the days kept stacking on top of each other until I no longer waited for their call, but braced against its absence. Then one morning, as I was reviewing a complicated filing on a securities case, I got a knock on my office door. It was Janice, my clerk, holding a large envelope with my name handwritten on the front. She said it had come through the mail, and there was no return address. I took it from her and stared at the handwriting. Something about it looked familiar, and I waited until I was alone before opening it. Inside was a long letter written in blue ink. It was from my mom, and as soon as I saw her handwriting, my hands began to shake. She had written 4 full pages explaining how ashamed she felt for missing the ceremony, how my father had been the one to insist they stay home, how he had said it would be embarrassing to be seen at a federal appointment when his own friends were dealing with job losses and inflation, how he claimed it would look like bragging in front of family who had not accomplished as much. She said she had wanted to go, had begged him to go, and when he refused she stayed back, but felt miserable the whole time. She said she watched the recording later online and cried from start to finish. She told me she had never seen me look more beautiful or powerful, and she regretted not being there more than anything else in her life, and she ended by saying she knew words could never undo what had happened, but she hoped one day I would let her explain in person and maybe allow her to make it right. I read the letter 5 times in a row, sitting there frozen, trying to take it all in. And for a moment I wanted to believe it. I wanted to hold on to those words and let them mend what had cracked in me since the swearing in, but there was also a part of me that questioned everything. Was this just guilt talking? Was this an attempt to ease her own conscience? Did she send it secretly without my father knowing? Or had they finally begun to feel the weight of being cut off? I folded the letter back and put it in the drawer, and for the rest of the day I walked around with it, replaying in my head over and over again. When I got home that night, I pulled out the old photo album from the living room shelf and flipped through pictures from my childhood, birthdays, family vacations, school plays, graduations, all moments they had once shown up for, and I asked myself if this one mistake, this one absence, should erase all of that. But the answer did not come quickly, because this was not just about the ceremony. It was about the years leading up to it, all the ways I had felt second, all the times they had favored my brother, all the ways I had chased their validation and kept coming up short. And this absence had simply been the final confirmation that nothing had really changed. But now I had her words in writing. Now I had some part of her reaching out, and I did not know if I could ignore it completely, so I wrote back, not a long reply, just a short note saying I got her letter and that I needed more time to process things. I did not promise anything. I did not say I forgave her. I just acknowledged it and mailed it back to the P.O. box listed on the envelope. And as the days went by, I did not hear from her again, not for a while, and I let myself sink back into the rhythm of work, court cases, hearings, lunch breaks, late nights on the bench, the kind of schedule that left little room for personal chaos. But then one Sunday afternoon, as I was sitting in the park with my coffee, a call came in from an unknown number. I ignored it at first, but then it rang again and again, and I finally picked up. It was my father, his voice quiet, his tone unlike anything I had heard from him before. He asked if we could meet just once, that he wanted to talk in person, and that he had made a mistake. He said he did not want to lose his daughter, and that he had seen the ceremony video too, and cried even though he would never admit that to anyone else. And in that moment my throat closed up. I was not ready for this call. I was not ready to decide whether I believed him or not, but I also knew this moment had been one I had dreamed of for years. The moment he would reach out, the moment he would own his mistakes and maybe try to repair what had broken. And now that it was here, I had no idea what to do with it. I told him I would think about it, and hung up. And then I just sat there in that park, staring at nothing as the wind blew leaves all around me, and I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted all over again. I walked into my office with a strange mix of heaviness and calm sitting on my shoulders, and the early morning light poured through the windows, painting everything with a soft gold glow. But it felt hollow, because all the excitement I should have been feeling after being officially sworn in as a federal judge was muted by the absence of those who should have been there to cheer for me. I placed my bag down slowly, looking at the stack of case files waiting on my desk. But I could not bring myself to sit, yet I stood by the window, letting the silence sink in until my phone vibrated. It was a message from Rachel, my best friend. She wrote that a local news site had published a small piece about the ceremony, and my name was being shared across legal circles. She said she was proud and hoped I would see that even without the presence of my family, I had still accomplished something incredible. I smiled faintly, appreciating her words, but they could not fill the hole left by my parents and siblings. Ignoring my achievement, I remembered how I had sat alone in the front row yesterday, pretending I was too focused on the ceremony to notice the empty chairs next to me. I remembered the way the judge had looked at me with a quiet curiosity when she administered the oath, perhaps wondering why I had no one standing behind me with cameras or bouquets or even soft whispers of encouragement. I thought about that moment over and over again. It kept replaying in my head as I stood in the courtroom, with my right hand raised, swearing to uphold the law with integrity and fairness, while my heart quietly broke with each word. And yet somehow I had kept my voice steady, not letting the hurt show, not letting the years of sacrifice feel diminished by their absence. I shook off the memory and walked my desk, opening the top folder and diving into the details of a complicated corporate fraud case, something that would demand my full attention. And for a few hours it worked. I lost myself in facts, timelines, and legal precedents. But just after noon, my phone began ringing constantly. Messages poured in from extended family, friends, old classmates, even distant relatives I had not spoken to in years. Apparently, the article about my swearing in had gone viral. Someone had shared a clip from the courthouse, and within hours it had been reposted by several influential legal pages. The comments were filled with congratulations, admiration, and even sympathy from strangers who noticed that I stood alone during the ceremony. Some were questioning where my parents were, others were praising my strength. I scrolled through them slowly, stunned by how quickly the story had caught fire. It was surreal to see people I had never met calling me an inspiration, asking if I needed support or wanting to hear my journey. More than one person said they had been moved to tears seeing a woman of color rise so far and do it without anyone clapping in the background, and I did not know what to feel. Part of me was grateful, deeply touched that my loneliness had not gone unseen, and another part of me felt raw, exposed, because now the world knew what I had tried to carry quietly. I took a deep breath and turned off my phone for a while, needing to collect myself before facing it all again. I went for a walk around the block, letting the cool air clear my mind, but everywhere I went someone seemed to recognize me. A man in a coffee shop nodded and said he had just read about me. A woman passing by paused and whispered congratulations. And I realized that this thing was bigger than me now. My story had become something others were holding on to, drawing courage from, and it was both humbling and overwhelming. When I returned to my office, I found a large envelope sitting on my desk. It had been dropped off by a courier. Inside was a handwritten letter from Judge Collins, a respected retired federal judge had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the country. I read her words slowly, amazed that she had taken the time to write. She spoke about seeing the video and recognizing the loneliness in my eyes. She said she had once stood in similar shoes years ago when no one believed in her, and how that moment had defined her entire career. She wrote that true resilience was forged in the moments when applause is absent, and how she had no doubt I would become one of the most respected voices on the bench. Tears welled up in my eyes as I finished the letter, because it felt like she had reached into my soul and pulled out the words I had been too afraid to speak. I sat there holding her letter for a long time, until the ache in my chest softened just a little, and then I heard a knock on the door, and to my surprise it was Malcolm, a colleague from law school. We had not spoken much in recent years, but he had always been kind and driven. He said he had seen the news and just wanted to stop by and say that he was proud of me. He looked around the room awkwardly, then asked if I was okay, and for a moment I did not know how to answer, because part of me wanted to say I was fine, that I was focused on the work and the future and all the things people expect you to say when you reach a milestone. But another part of me wanted to scream and cry and ask why my parents could not even show up for 1 hour. I took a deep breath and simply said I was taking it one day at a time. Malcolm nodded and said that was more than enough before leaving behind a small potted plant with a note that said, "Keep growing your own way." And I smiled, because somehow that little gesture meant more than all the silence I had received from my family. That evening, I stayed late in the office reviewing more cases, taking calls from media outlets, and preparing a short official statement that would be released the next day. My assistant Carla offered to help manage the inquiries, and I was grateful for her support. She said she had seen many new judges come and go, but none had received this much attention so quickly, and I realized that the spotlight was not just on my title, it was on my story, and now I had to decide what to do with it. I spent the rest of the night thinking about how I could turn this moment into something more than just a viral post, perhaps a platform to speak on issues of representation, justice, and what it means to rise despite being unseen. I knew the road ahead would be complex, but I also knew I was ready for it, because if I could walk into that courtroom alone and still stand tall, then I could handle whatever came next, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real beginning of everything. I stood in front of the courthouse steps, letting the last rays of the setting sun hit my face as I clutched the copy of the newspaper article that now featured my name, my face, and my title in bold print. It had taken me years of sacrifice, relentless work, and a lot of lonely nights to get here, and now the whole world knew my name. The article spoke of my journey, my recent swearing in as a federal judge, and the noticeable absence of my parents at the ceremony. It had taken one reporter's curiosity to blow up into a viral moment, and now my inbox was filled with messages, calls from news anchors, and even distant relatives who never bothered with me before. Everyone suddenly wanted to know the full story behind why a woman would stand alone on the biggest day of her life. The story they wanted was scandalous, dramatic, heart-wrenching, but the real story was just years of being unseen, unheard, and unfavored, and now they all wanted to hear me tell it. And for the first time I decided to answer back. It had started with a quiet email from a local podcaster who focused on stories of resilience. Her words were kind, thoughtful, and she did not push for the drama. She just asked if I ever felt like sharing what it meant to stand on that stage alone and own my name, my title, and my power. And something about the simplicity of it broke through the wall I had built around my heart. I agreed, and we met in a quiet cafe off the main street, where I walked in wearing a simple dress, no makeup, and not even my court badge. I was just me, and when she pressed record I began to speak, and the words came out faster than I expected. I talked about the small things growing up that made me feel like I was always behind my older brother's shadow. I talked about the dinners where my achievements were brushed off while his were celebrated, the birthdays where he got full cakes and balloons, and I got a polite hug, the way my parents always made me feel like I was not quite enough, even when I was doing everything right. I spoke about college, how I got into one of the top law programs in the country, and my parents barely blinked while they threw my brother a lavish graduation party for a business degree from a local college. I talked about how I paid my own way through school, took extra jobs, taught tutoring sessions, and still managed to graduate at the top of my class, how I got into clerkships past the bar and worked my way into the courtroom, how I had faced judges who underestimated me, attorneys who tried to dismiss me, and still kept going. Then I told her about the day I got the call from the White House informing me that I was being considered for a federal judgeship. I had cried, not out of joy but out of sheer disbelief that after everything I had made it. And then I called my parents, expecting maybe, just maybe, they would finally say they were proud of me. But instead my mother told me that my brother had just gotten a new job and that they would be busy helping him move across the country. I remember staring at the phone, wondering if I had imagined their voices, if maybe I was calling the wrong number. And then she said congratulations in the flattest voice and hung up. So I went to the ceremony alone. I wore the dress I had saved up, for I walked into the courtroom with my head held high, and I swore in with only my mentor, my assistant, and a couple of colleagues in the audience. I smiled, for the cameras shook the hands of dignitaries, and then went home alone, ordered takeout, and sat in silence. And yet it was one of the most powerful days of my life, because it proved that I did not need anyone's approval to feel worthy. When the podcast episode aired, it exploded. It got shared on social media, picked up by blogs, and even national news channels. People began writing to me, sharing their own stories of being overlooked, of being the black sheep of their families, of becoming everything they dreamed of, only to find no one cheering for them. And it turned into a movement. Soon I was invited to speak at conferences, panels, universities. And every time I stepped onto a stage and looked out at the sea of faces, I realized that my story was not just mine, it was universal. It was the story of every girl who was told to be quiet, every boy who was told he was not enough, every adult who had to raise themselves emotionally while pretending everything was fine. One day, as I was leaving an event, a young woman ran up to me, breathless, tears in her eyes, and told me she had dropped out of law school last year because her parents kept comparing her to her cousin, and nothing she did felt like it mattered. But after hearing my story, she re-enrolled. She said maybe she did not need their approval, maybe her own voice was enough, and I hugged her tightly, thinking back to the version of me who once stood in a library crying quietly after getting her first A+ because no one at home would care to hear about it. It was not long before a major publishing house reached out offering to turn my story into a book. They wanted to call it Worthy, and as I signed the contract, I realized I no longer felt the sting when people mentioned my parents or asked if they ever came around the truth was they called once after the podcast blew up, left a voicemail saying they did not expect things to go so public and maybe we could talk, but it was not an apology and it was not about me, it was about how they looked, and I decided then that I did not owe anyone space in my life. Just because we shared blood, I had created my own family, my chosen people, who stood with me in courtrooms, backstage, in studios, and in life. And that was more than enough. Recently, I stood on the steps of a university giving the keynote speech at a graduation, and as I looked at the sea of caps and gowns, I told them that sometimes the people who are supposed to be your biggest supporters will be your loudest critics or your coldest walls, but that does not mean your story ends in silence. It means you write it louder. I told them that it is okay to feel the pain, but never let it stop you from stepping into your power. I ended with the line that had become my mantra. I went alone, but I arrived fully, and the applause was thunderous not because of the pain in the story, but because of the power that came after it. And as I walked off the stage, I smiled not for the crowd, not for the cameras, but for the little girl inside me who once thought she had to earn love by being perfect. She was finally free. She was finally home. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.